So here we are in part 4 of the series on taking a high poly STL, breaking it down so that it can be used in TaleSpire or other virtual tabletops. The series so far, we've covered how to break down the model, create a normal map, and do the color texturing all in Blender. This video focuses on the MOAR or PBR. So in a nutshell, that's your metallics, your glossiness, and the ambient shadows. There are two approaches to this that I'm going to cover in the video. First is the simplest, which is the fake PBR approach, where we basically leverage some aspects of the PBR and make it work for our purposes. The second approach is a little bit more technically complicated, and it is going to be a true PBR approach for people who really want to make sure you're doing it the right way. Ultimately, both get about the same results when we're in TaleSpire, just because the true PBR approach, the subtleties of it may or may not matter for your model. That said, I'm going to talk about what it is, why it is, and how it kind of all starts fitting together, and we'll make sure that you can see how to actually paint metallics and gloss on your mini, things like that. So if you've been in the series before, you're already familiar with this Crodlu model. This is already sort of pre-PBR'd with a little bit here and there, not realistically, but just something to kind of show off what we've got for like metals and gloss and some metals down here, things like that. Before we dive into actually the process of doing this in Blender, I want to talk about the PBR and what it all breaks down to. So we'll start just by looking at the end results in TaleWeaver, then talking about the PBR file a little bit so you can kind of understand what the channels mean and how they break down, and how to conceptualize it for the fake PBR, and then how it's kind of supposed to work and what we're doing with it when we fake it out. And with that said, we'll dive into TaleWeaver. All right. So in TaleWeaver, the third image texture that you add is your metallic AO roughness texture. So that is this guy here, which looks like a bright green, yellow, red, sort of blobby sort of image. Much like the normal texture, it doesn't read quite as logically as you normally think right out the gate. What I do want to show you in TaleWeaver is sort of what the end results look like on the Crodlu. But I wanted to introduce this first just to kind of give you an idea what we're going to be talking about when we talk about breaking out the channels. So in this model, there are some metallics on the belt, some metallics here on the keyboard, and metallics on the glasses. And there's actually quite a bit around the edges of his outfit. So I wanted to kind of show you that, so you just kind of keep that in the back of your mind when we start breaking down this PBR texture. But let's actually take a look at the Crodlu model. We'll put its correct skin on. Let's pop just no skin, pop its normal texture on it, and let's clear out this texture for a second. Okay. So with a base model with a normal texture on, we're going to not have the color on just for this demonstration, so you can see sort of what I'm talking about when we're adding fake PBR. Now, this isn't about true PBR at this moment. This is all about the fake PBR approach. So the fake PBR approach relies on leveraging the way that normal paint methods push data into the alpha channel. So that's our transparency. And it leverages the base colors. I'll talk a little about this more when I do a little more technical talk, but let's just see the end results at a flat way so you can catch it in a simple place. So I'm going to put a green swatch on, and this is a green swatch that is at sort of a 75% up on the AO and the alpha. So we see it actually gets a little bit of gloss going. If I push this up again, and this one's one where it's 100, it starts getting very glossy. Now, the paint wash in TaleWeaver is great. It also will cover some mistakes in the fake PBR process, but just so you know, that does affect our results a little bit. The metallic channel, so if we're thinking about this as technically green's our AO channel, or AO plus our roughness channel, which don't think about it too hard if you, we'll get to that in the explanation, but just for now, think about green as your AO, but also with gloss in this case. If we go red, all right, so now this is a little bit different than what you might have expected. So this is red at a 50%. This is red at 100%. Now red is our metals. So you may be wondering why, wait a minute, why is this gone full black? Well, there's no green channel to give it the ambient occlusion that's going to give it some light. So what this is acting like is like it's in full shadow. If that's confusing, don't worry about it. Just know that when I'm talking in layman's terms for the fake PBR purposes, you'll hear me say things like green is gloss, and I don't say red is metal, because if it's just red, you're going to get these really blown out blacks. Instead, you'll hear me say gold is metal, which is yellow. Now, the reason for this is, for technically, is that the yellow is against our color theory normally, but red and green in RBG are yellow. So red plus green is yellow. What's happening when we're making a metal texture is we really need light. So we need to make sure we've got some AO present, or the increase in the AO channel, which makes it have more light reflecting. We need a little bit of gloss. So we're going to get that gloss from the lack of transparency. So that's our alpha channel. And then we can go from there. So when we're looking at this red at 100% here, we're actually having a full gloss and a full metal with nothing else. When we're looking at it here, and I'll pop over to the 100, which is it's blown out, it's a little too much, but this is one where we've got 100% in our green channel, which is our AO, 100% in our red channel, which is our metals, and 100% in our alpha channel, which is our roughness and glossiness. So I would say, as you're working, and keep this in the back of your mind for later, that going full blown into the channels will produce kind of unrealistic results unless this is what you're going for. But always keep it maybe tapped down a little bit. So like this is a 75 and it looks like a really nice brushed metal, and you can go from there. So I just throw that out as a, hey, this is where some of the theory is going to start coming from as we're working. And if you get a little bogged down, because I do take a lot of time with the explanations and want to make sure people get a full picture of it. But if it's too much and you start to glaze over a bit, remember you can use the fake PBR method to get good results. And in that method, not in real PBRs, but in that method, green is glossy, yellow is metal, and there's a few basics you want to lay down on your mini first, but other than that, you should be pretty good to go. While I'm here, I do want to show you that if you're not sure about painting your mini and you're just kind of watching this whole series to get a feel for things, remember you don't have to have, an MAOR or a PBR channel or image. You can just kind of do without it. But also, if you want to have like a mini that is all a solid thing, like I think this is just some color swatches I pull into play with, you can make a straight metal mini by having a color swatch and a color swatch, and you can have something that looks like it's iron or silver, or this is sort of like a really garish looking anodized aluminum sort of look going. So just keep that in mind. Feel free to you can follow the rigid ideas and rules, but play is part of creation. So just make sure you take the time to play around what works, what doesn't work, experiment and see what it is that's going to suit you and your kind of vision for what you're doing. And as you might discover something weird and it's better than your original vision, which is, I always like when I encounter those sort of fun things. All right, so that is just kind of, once again, previewing the end results in TaleWeaver. Now I'm going to talk about the actual channels and what they look like and the differences between the fake PBR and the real PBR and how we're going to get there. All right, so I've popped into GIMP just so I can kind of show you what these look like on the PBR files, and then sort of how it all comes together. So first channel you have is your red channel. Second channel you have is green. Third channel is blue. And the fourth is alpha, which I'm just going to sort of demonstrate with gray. So that's channel. So the first channel is our red channel. That's our metallics. So that's one. This will be our metal. Second channel is our AO, which is sort of light reflectivity and self-shadowing. Third channel is not in use. And the fourth channel is our roughness. So in a true PBR, each of these channels are simply an independent sort of vessel that's carrying over the information to your, whatever system is reading your PBR file, in this case, TaleWeaver and TaleSpire. That's the true PBR approach. So this is a completely independent value to all these others, and they do not interact in any way. For the fake PBR approach, we are leveraging the fact that in a texture file and visually and conceptually, they kind of do interact. So what we end up having here is, and this is going back to kind of as a reminder from before, is red and green are yellow, and that is, why yellow becomes important in our approach. Though someone, a VFX artist, is like, that doesn't make sense because you don't mix the channels, and you don't, but it's a visual thing that we'll be able to read and leverage for our purposes for the fake PBR. And roughness is intangible in a true PBR because it's just a value being stored in that channel. But you're like, well, it's the transparency channel, but it's transparency against nothing. It's just a value. So roughness itself is not a channel that represents transparency against anything. It's just a value being transmitted. That said, it is also a transparency if we conceptualize it that way for the fake PBR. So whereas this is a part of our, let me just make sure this is part of the fake approach. And that is sort of how we'll think about it for the fake approach. I'll also say that for the fake approach, one way I like to think about it, and this is where it gets a little bit esoteric, is to think about how each of these things interact, but just for the fake approach once again. All right, so we'll start with a basic gradient that illustrates our green and our red channel. And then I'm going to add another gradient just to try to show that the sort of that roughness alpha channel. So here what I've illustrated is not the sort of true PBR, but how we're going to be leveraging it. So what we have here is our fourth channel, which is our alpha / our roughness. Up here we have our second channel, which is our AO / green. And down here we have our first channel, which is metallic / red. So if we can conceptualize it like a spectrum like this, at least for the purpose of our fake PBR, where as we're adding the fourth channel of alpha, we are decreasing our roughness. So the intensity of our green, or the lack of transparency in it, is an increase in our AO and an increase in our gloss. So in this corner, we have our high gloss. Down here, we have an increase in our alpha, which is a decrease in roughness. So we've got gloss and we've got metallic. So this is technically, this corner would be metal plus gloss. So here in the middle, we have gloss and AO and metal. So once again, not the official method, but this is kind of how, if you are having trouble conceptualizing them as independent channels, if you conceptualize them as interrelated channels, this is sort of what you get. Now, the downside of conceptualizing them as interrelated channels is that because they're affecting each other, you have certain limitations. So for example, we can't achieve metal without gloss in this sort of model. And we can't achieve gloss without AO, or gloss and metal and AO. So it becomes sort of this, it sort of limits the lines at which you can cross, because we are interrelating these values that otherwise work independently. So what this illustrates is that even though these channels act fully independently in the sort of the true sense of what a PBR is supposed to be, we can conceptualize them as interrelated, and in terms of a normal color spectrum, just to conceptualize it in a different way. Now, the limitations of conceptualizing it this way is that we can't achieve certain combinations. So there are some subtle variations that you would be able to get from a true PBR approach that you won't get here. in my opinion, for the purposes of TaleSpire minis, it really doesn't need to have that level of subtlety. So if all of this has been a little confusing, just don't worry about that. You don't need to necessarily understand it to leverage it. And I'll walk you through the steps, whether it is that you want to do the fake or the real process. But I like to take some time to explain the whole thing because I think it is helpful to know what you're doing and why. All right. So let's start setting up what this looks like in Blender so you can actually get to the process of painting the metallics and glosses on your mini. All right, so back in Blender, we're going to go to the Shading tab, and we're going to start by doing the True Fake Super Fake PBR. So this is one where we're not going to preview like we have here. We're just going to go fast and loose and get those colors down, and I'll talk about some of the flaws of it, but this is just a true super fake. So we're going to go into the Shading tab. So you probably have a setup like this, where you have your normal map connected to your shader through the normal map node, and your color texture paint connected to the base color. So we're going to make a copy, using the little copy button, of this material, and we're going to type this one as the super fake PBR. And this is super fake because we're not going to bother setting up a preview for it. We're just going to have fun and be a little fast and loose. So we're going to take the image node that had our color in it, and we're going to remove the image from the node. It doesn't get rid of our image, it just removes it from the node. We're going to create a new image, and we're going to call this our Crowdloo Super Fake PBR. And we're going to set the base to 248 by 248, and we want to be certain here to set the color to default to be transparent, so there's no alpha channel. And we hit OK. And now we go into texture painting. We'll see that there's no Crowdloo here to greet us. Because we're in a material preview, we need to go into, we're in solids, we need to go to the material preview. And there we go. Our transparencies here will just appear as black. So I'm going to set up my color palette really quickly. And I just want to do that by getting those channels that I'd be looking for, like my yellow. I'm going to pull up just a straight up red. Did I do that one right? Nope, I was a little bit off. So get rid of that and add a new one. And then we'll also do a full just green. Bam. All right, so things to know about the super fake approach. This approach is very fast and loose. It's just to get some generalizations, and you basically are just going to take your colors, where we go for that very rudimentary thing that we're leveraging, which is where we can use the green channel, which is full green, full alpha, to create gloss. We're going to go for the idea that yellow is gold or our metals, based off of sort of how we're faking the approach. We don't want to go full strength, because we're going to just make it at the very end to give it a little more punch. So we're going to say we don't want the strength really above 60 or 70, and we are going to just paint right on it. So I know I want the eyes glossy. Okay, done. I know I want this eye glossy. Okay, done. I'm not going to bother with masking for now. And I'm just like, all right, I know I want the beak kind of glossy. And I might say, oh, that's a little too strong. Let's go for a lighter touch. Drop this down and do some different strokes along it. And now, there's two things to know with this super fake approach. One is that we can't really make mistakes in it. We can. There's a solution for if we do, but we can't because what you'll notice is there are no eraser tools on the side. What this means is that if we make mistakes and we end up having a lot of overpaint, we can be diligent about it and hit Control Z as they come up. Or we have to be very good at some painting situations, or we have to resave the file as a proxy. So here is what I mean by that. So here on the tail, actually let's get something more extreme. Let me put a big mark right here. I'm going to put it in bright yellow. So I'm going to put this as, let's go for full strength, low radius. Oops. It doesn't really look like it says oops, but we'll just pretend it does. Now, if I made that mistake and had this sort of wild thing going on here, I don't have an eraser. If I go into my tools, you'll notice there's an erase alpha and an add alpha. If I erase alpha, it seems like it's going to put me on the right. It seems like it's going to put me on the right track because it erases. But here's the problem. It's actually only erasing that independent alpha channel. I can go back to add alpha and it'll bring my mistakes right back in, bright and bold. Even more so. So what do? We have another option called subtract. If I choose subtract and I have that color selected, I can get rid of it and it's gone. This is not ideal, but we'll just kind of roll with it for now. So if you have mistakes, you have the options of subtracting or erasing alpha. This can get messy because if you have a lot of subtleties and have gone back over them, you will find that this is a little bit messy, especially if you've got colors next to each other. So if I've got, say, a bit of red and a bit of green and a bit of green, and I'm doing something here, and I'm like, oh shoot, let me, I can't really erase alpha, so I'll go back in and subtract. Well, I can subtract green, and you notice what it did there. It subtracted the green channel. So the yellow minus the green is red, but I've got my red channel. I could subtract red, and I keep the green in both cases. So it gets a little bit weird. And you just have to kind of be aware, and this can all be confusing. The other option is to erase the alpha and treat this like your eraser, because it can be your eraser. So if I erase alpha, and then I go back and I go to mix in, it looks just like fine, like I'm painting. That is my recommendation, because if you make mistakes and you erase alpha, like I said, and you're like, wait, but you can't do that. You just said, if you make mistakes and erase alpha and then paint back over it, Blender will remember what you did and save it into the image file, the color channels. So it will show up in TaleWeaver unless you save it as a proxy in a program that is designed for drawing. Because those programs treat the channels differently, you can kind of leverage that. So if I've made a lot of mistakes, and we'll show you both versions. I'll use this copy, we'll copy it in. And I take it and I save it in like Microsoft Paint 3D or GIMP, and I do a save as, it will assume that the alpha channel should be applying transparencies to the color channels, and it will impute those into the color channels, unless you set it up to tell it not to, which is, you can do in GIMP, I think, but don't worry about that. Use Paint 3D if you've got it or something else. The point being is you can kind of compress the channels to make it imitate what you have here and ignore the way that Blender would normally treat the alpha channel. So we're going to just do a little bit more painting on this guy. I'll make some mistakes and erase them, and then I will show you what that looks like in TaleWeaver. And just to kind of show what is helpful when I'm working and I'm doing a fake PBR approach, I might just say, okay, let me preview what happens if. So I'm just going to slowly sort of do a bit of a gradient here, just because I want to see how these appear. Like I said, this doesn't give you the full range of a true PBR. It is not anywhere near that. But as I said before, for the purposes of TaleSpire, it works, it ends up kind of working out. So let's just sort of get a little play going here. And I'm going to kind of just lower that along back into just the greenish gloss sort of channel. Now those aren't full-blown channels, but that's the idea. And once again, just to kind of exhibit the erase alpha situation, so you can kind of see what I'm referring to, I'm going to go for a full erase alpha line here. And why not? I'm just give them like a little stripe component. And then let's do a little bit of like strength, like a little brushing here. So you kind of see if we just sort of reduce that down and do like a little gradienting. So that gives us just a little bit of a place to play around. And I think if I remember right, did I play with this on the neck as well? No, I didn't. So I'm just going to do that real quick. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is save this. So I'm going to take this image and I'm going to save it. And I'm also going to do a second save so I can have a proxy copy. So I'm going to save as, and we'll call this one the... All right, so now let's pop into TaleWeaver and see how well our super fake PBR did. All right, so here we are in TaleWeaver. So in TaleWeaver, we're just here to preview those PBRs before we move on to the next approach. So I'm going to load in the fake PBR. Oh, that's one from a different demo. I apologize. There's the one we want. That's the fake TBR. And so we can see those marks, the stray marks on the neck, that even though we erased them are still present because of the way the alpha channel is stored. And that's sort of showing that. We can also see some of the fun stuff we drew on the tail, just to kind of see how those ranges of metals were sort of affecting things, with going from reds to yellows to oranges and on down. So it kind of gives something fun to look at. But this does show that using the eraser tool in Blender, if you're doing this super fake PBR approach, does cause issues unless you resave it as a proxy. So I'm going to pop over to my super fake proxy, and we can see how that turned out. And we see on this one where I erased, now by saving it in another program, it has kind of imposed the transparency level on those other channels, so we get more like what we were expecting. Now, that was a super quick super fake PBR approach, just to get some gloss on the beak and some metals on some of the metal components. And while not perfect, and obviously very fast and loose and has a lot of tracings that I was just experimenting with, it's also not bad. So if you just need to drop some gloss on an eye, a little bit of metal on a fitting, a little bit of gloss here and there, the super fake PBR approach will work and will get you some, at least, relatively decent results. So now let's go over to the next approach, which is painting while previewing using a fake PBR. All right. So back in Blender, we can see this awful thing that we made. That's fine. So what I'm going to do now is pop over to the shading tab. So this was our super duper fake. Let's see what it'd be like if we were actually previewing this. So I'm going to give myself a little room to work, and we're going to make a copy of our super fake, and we're going to call this just the fake PBR, because we're at least going to make the effort to preview it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take this image node, and I'm just going to make a copy of it. I made a copy of it. Now this image node, I'm going to move back to be my Crodlu color. So now it's back to kind of how it was on the color one. Now previewing this requires just a little bit of setup. So we are going to need a few extra nodes. We are going to add a separate color node. We are going to add a invert node. We are going to add a color ramp node. So one thing we're going to do with this preview is, out of the gate, I'm going to let you know that ambient occlusion is difficult to perceive and to preview in this environment because we've already got light and shadow. And we cannot superimpose ambient occlusion onto our shader. The way we're going to get around that is, one, we can just forgo previewing the ambient occlusion because we're not really using it with a fake PBR, so don't worry about it, is what I'm going to say. So here's what we're going to do. The alpha of our super fake PBR is going to go into the color of our inversion node, and that is going to tie into our roughness. So you can already see our gloss is present. So this is the alpha. So that's, we'd expect the alpha, the transparency, our fourth channel, is just inverted so Blender can read it how it should. Goes into the roughness channel. So that's really all you need. Alpha is roughness, alpha is roughness, we just run it through an inversion. Now we're going to take the color from our fake PBR and plug it into the color node, our color connector of the separate color. Now our red channel is just our metallics. However, we have to account for our alpha. As you guys remember, we erased this. So we want to make sure that we can kind of judge that erasing amount. So that way we can just save it as a proxy, just like we did before. So to preview that, we're going to have the alpha of our fake PBR be the factor of a color ramp. And then we're going to add a mix node. So for our mix node, I've put it right over the red, but otherwise red would be our primary, our A, and the result would go to our metallic. Sorry, no, red would be our secondary. Let me unplug that. So the color channel for red, which is our metallic, goes into the secondary of our mix node. The color of our color ramp becomes the factor and the color of our mix node, which go to the metallic. So what this is doing is it's saying for the alpha channel of our fake PBR to act as a mask that hides the red when it is not, when it would be, that hides the metallics when it would not be visible based off of our alpha. This allows our fake PBR image to be previewed. Now, when it comes to ambient occlusion, it isn't really going to be what we think. So my recommendation is to forego previewing it. That said, if you want to get a somewhat of a proxy, we can do that. So previewing the AO is very subtle. I don't find there's a lot of value in it, but here's what you can do. So I'm going to scoot these over so I have a little extra room. I'm going to duplicate this mix node with Control C, Control V, and I'm going to do the same setup I did here, but this time with my green channel being my secondary and this being my primary and my factor. And I want to treat this almost like a multiply onto my image because that kind of imitates a little bit of the darkness we're going to get. So we'll add another mix node. And we'll make this a color mix. Remember, mix nodes are tricky because they come in as like a float mix, a vector mix. They can be other things. You have to select the mix type and it greatly changes the option. So color mix from the dropdown. And we're going to make this a multiply. And we're going to take the color as our primary, which is our A socket. And let's move the results over there. And the results of this will become our B. We can adjust the factor here, but in truth, hanging out about there is about right. If we want to skip this, we could just mute it. And you can see that the results are pretty subtle, and I don't even know that it adds that much of a darkening effect, so I might even drop this a little bit lighter. But this gives you a general idea. So we'll just leave that at 0.5. We'll just call it there for now. Like I said, this is a gross similitude, and I'm not a proponent of it being the best. So you can probably just skip it altogether. But regardless, this is the setup for previews. So to review the setup for previews, your fake PBR image, the alpha channel goes into a color ramp and into an invert node. The invert node will then connect directly to your roughness because your alpha channel of your fake PBR is the equivalent of your roughness. The alpha goes into the color ramp, which then acts like a mask for our channels for red and green. The red channel goes into a mixer node, which then converts that color to a mask onto the green and moves the results over into our metallic node of our shader. Same thing with the green, except for there is no AO plugin, and we wouldn't necessarily preview it this way, but we can kind of come up with a gross similitude of it by putting it through this multiply node and attached. So now when we go into texture painting, we can paint directly onto the model. So if I wanted to say paint some glossy metal, and I want to make sure I've got the right image selected, so I'm painting on my super fake PBR. And now when I go to paint, I can paint directly on it. And I can see bright metals. If I want to paint bright metals, I can do a little bit of gloss. Obviously, it's a lot. This gives me a lot more control if I want to just touch things up with a little bit on the fill tool. And I do recommend doing just a little bit of, when you're doing this approach, I always recommend doing a light fill of a very subtle green channel, because that's going to give you a little brightness from that AO. It's also going to prevent the whole model from just being completely flat. So I do recommend doing that. And from here, you just kind of go to town with whatever you want to do. This is just obviously a demo, so I'm not going to fix it up too much. And that's how you set up your nodes, so you can preview what you're doing directly on your miniature. Now, that said, all of this has been the fake approach, which means we're leveraging the color in the channels and painting them as if they're color, which is a little bit of a backwards way of doing it, but it works and produces decent enough results for what we're doing. Its downside is it does limit the sort of the span of some of the channels. That said, there's a lot of options to play with here. So we could say directly just adding red channel, or directly just adding green, and then also adding alpha, all separately, in a sense, painting each of your color channels, or sorry, painting each of your 4 channels independently. That starts getting complicated, and by the time you're like, I want to paint each channel independently by hand, rather than using the true fake approach where you sort of approximate, yellow or green, I would say at that point, you probably just want to go ahead and do the real PBR approach, which is what we'll cover next. That said, if you're comfortable with this and you feel like it's getting you the results you need, the PBR police will not show up at your door and tell you what you're doing is wrong. Though it is a different way to conceptualize a PBR, you can still get the same results. And if you're having trouble kind of envisioning the channels as values and how do you conceptualize that in your mind, this is an approach that probably will work for you. And then once you get comfortable with it, you might be like, okay, I think I can get the other stuff now. But this is simple enough. So the fake PBR, the super fake PBR, that's what we got for that. So let's say we want to get more complicated. Let's go on to the actual PBR. All right, so we're back in Blender, and this is the model before I had done any of the fake or super fake PBR to it. So to get the true PBR, not the fake one, we're going to start by doing some things in the shading tab. So the first step in the shading tab is to get our ambient occlusion map. So this will act as our AO, our green channel. And we can do this because the ambient occlusion isn't something we create or paint on the model. That's for like metals and stuff. The ambient occlusion is just how is the light going to act on it. So to do that, we want to have our high poly model, our low poly model, and our cage. This is going to be very similar to when we baked our normal map. We're going to bake our ambient occlusion map. So we'll have our high poly model revealed, and we'll select our low poly model. And we probably have a setup like this with our color and our normal map, and that's fine. Nothing else should be changed here. So I'm going to add an image texture node. I'm going to create new, and I'm going to have this one, we'll call it the Crodlu True AO. And I'll get the size up just like I do for most of my image. And in this case, I don't need to change the color to be transparent. We'll just leave the color as black and hit OK. So now under our bake settings, so just like when we did our normal map, we're just going to bake again. So render engine should be cycles. For bake, you may have it on normal or diffuse from another thing you're working on. Just change it to ambient occlusion. Make sure you've got selective to active, cage, and the low poly cage. And just like we did with our normal map, we can shift click the high poly model to have it our secondary select, or click on our high poly model and then control click down to our low poly model, so that we have our low poly as our primary selection, high poly as our secondary. And now all we have to do is hit bake. Now this bake can take some time, so you might want to take a break for a moment while it wraps up. All right, so when your ambient occlusion map is done baking, it should look something like this. It'll be a black and white image with imitated shadows on the model. So it'll look like a little bit of self-shadowing. Since this is not the scene painted version that I did of this miniature, you'll notice that it is a little hard to tell exactly what's going on, but we can spot certain things. Like in this area, we can see this is where one of the straps is, and that it has put some shadowing in the edge of where the strap is, or between like parts of the scales or around the neck, things like that. So this is as we would expect, and it looks good. We're not worried about it. This will act as our ambient occlusion map. So with our ambient occlusion map created, we can now work on our connectors. So we are going to now connect all of this to our material. The end goal of this will be that we can paint our metallics and roughnesses and get those sort of settled out, and then combine all these images and composite them into an exported file. So to set this up, we're going to have to set it up two ways. First, we're going to go over how to set it up so we can actually work it, and then I'm going to talk about how the export plays out. So to begin, we're going to take that ambient occlusion map that we created. And remember, ambient occlusion is actually our sort of our green channel, and it's going to act as that darkening and shadowing effect. So to get that previewing, I'm going to add a mix node. So I'm just going to search for it because that's a little bit easier for me. So my mix node comes in, and if you remember, these don't come in as color nodes initially. I'm going to change this mix node to be a color node. I'm going to change the type to either multiply or darken, either way. And I'm going to have the color for that be my secondary, and the color of my texture be the primary, and then the results of those go into the base color. So let me hide that high poly again so we can see. And so what this is doing is adding those subtle shadows. So if we look here, this is sort of with, let's kind of put that factor down to 0. So that's with none of the ambient occlusion. We can trace that up to 100, or sort of the full percent. That's with it sort of on full bar. Now, it actually ends up looking about this mid-range. So when I do a multiply, I just normally leave it at that 0.5, and you're going to get a decent preview of how that's going to affect your end result in TaleWeaver and in TaleSpire. So that's sort of set, and we won't be touching that. All right, so now we're going to add 2 more image nodes, and these will represent our metallic channel, which is our red channel, and our roughness channel, which is our alpha. So we're going to do that by just adding 2 new blank image texture nodes. So I'll just make that one, copy of it. We'll create a new one, and we'll have this be Produlu Metals. Leave that as is, and this can be transparent or it can be full black. Let's go ahead and drop it to full black, and not have it be, not have it have a transparency by default. Okay. Same thing with this one. We'll call this one our Produlu Roughness. And we will leave it as the other one, so to carry it over and hit OK. Produlu Metals, we'll just connect the metals to the metal. So metallic node to the metallic node, straight connection, no worries there. The roughness we have to do something different with. If we connect roughness to roughness, it goes full bore gloss. Like you just hopped out of an oil spill. We don't want that. We want it to be the reverse of that. So we have to add an inversion. If we add an invert node, just drop it right in the middle, and that will invert it. And now we have him. He's fully rough, which isn't not that appealing, but it'll work for right now. We'll talk about that. Okay, so now we're ready for painting. So when we go to the texture painting tab, one of the things we want to be considerate of is that when we're painting the metal and the roughness channels, that we are selecting those to the side. So when you're in texture painting, you can choose what you're painting on over on this side under your tools. So if I want to paint on roughness, I want to make sure I've got that selected. If I want to paint on metals, I've got that selected. The other thing I want to keep in mind is we're painting in grayscale, because we're simply painting the values into the space. White is going to give a higher value, black is the low value, so it's just grayscale. The first thing I suggest, though, is fixing this roughness situation. This is an unnaturally overly roughed surface, so it just doesn't look right. It looks very flat and very dead. So I would start by taking a good gray that's like maybe a half gray, and getting your paint bucket and just filling your model. So this is going to allow some light to reflect off of it so that it's not just flat and dull. Then you can build up or build down layers if you feel like you need to. So then say I could take I can do a weaker brush at full white, and I can sort of doll that on to get my glosses up on the beak or in the eye. I can also say I can go full strength, but maybe pull it down to a gray instead. And then I'm actually selecting my amount of gloss over here on my gray scale and being direct with it instead of balancing out levels of strength. So it really kind of depends on your approach, but that's how you would do that. And that's how you're going to start painting levels of glossiness. But I might still use the levels of strength scenario just to kind of help with some of the areas that I want to have more of a feathered or faded look, and things like that. There, obviously, you can use the tools the same way you would when you were doing your normal painting. And I'm not going to do the full paint of this guy because it's been a lot of time doing that, and he needs to be reworked anyway. This was my demo version. But that's the basics. One thing to keep in mind is when you're doing your metals. So with metals, I might say, okay, I don't want to go full blown. I want to keep it, maybe I'll go full strength, but not full strength here. And let's paint a little bit of metal. So we'll use a larger area for the demo. So when I'm painting on my metallics, because this is a true PBR approach, I'm painting only the metallics channel. So this gives me a wider range of metallics, but it does also mean they don't come out the gate quite as direct. So this is a full metal, but it's very rough. It's a very rough into metal surface. So you get a little bit of that metallic effect, but it doesn't pop or shine. To do that, we'll have to go back over into our roughness, and then we can tweak that level and give it a little more gloss or a lot of gloss if we want to give it that super like ridiculously unnatural shine, or we can tweak it up and down like we were doing. You'll have to play with the values to figure out what you feel looks right. But that is the beauty of also doing this full PBR approach, is you have a lot more options in terms of the subtle differences between things. And you can read a lot about what makes a metal look good, or what makes a metal, what are the values for a good aluminum? What are the values for a good rusted metal, or a good value for this? And you'll see some great sort of demonstrations that show like a matrix of roughness versus metallics and what that looks like. But just so you know, you can really get a lot of control with this other method. So in the spirit of brevity, though, you've seen me paint metals, you've seen me paint glosses. None of this is new. You can kind of see how all this plays out. Now let's talk about how we actually composite these things into an image. Because if you remember, these are all separate images, and before we were just going up here and exporting our images. That won't work because for TaleWeaver, it needs to be that composited PBR/MOAR image where this is the red channel, that's the green channel, this is the other channel. So how do we do that? So we'll do that back in our shading tab. So I would recommend not just writing over this, but let's make a copy of it. So I'm going to do a copy, and I'm going to say this is my PBR bake. We're going to bake in it. And what we'll do is we don't need our normal map. We let it kind of hang out over here. We want to unplug our AO. We want to unplug this. We actually just want to unplug everything. Unplug that too. So we're going to take these guys, and we are going to plug a little bit back in with what we know. We know that our roughness gets stored in our alpha channel of the image, which means we want it to be a level of transparency. So for this, I'm going to plug in my roughness channel color to my actual alpha material output. Next, we're going to get Blender to believe that these are our color channels. So we're going to do that by making a combine color. So we're going to go create a new node, do a combine color node. And on our combine color node, we're going to have our AO, which we know is our green, go into the green channel, and our metals, which we know is our red, go into the red channel. And we're going to put that over to our base color. And now this may look a little more familiar, because this probably looks distinctively like our fake PBR. Only this one's obviously painted in and possibly much better. So this is what we would expect and what would look good. Obviously not fully painted, but it'll do. So now we have everything, basically our channels being treated as if they are our coloring for the material preview. So now we just have to bake it. So we'll create a new image texture. We want to make sure the back color of this one is transparent because we want the default to be transparent here. And we'll call this our code blue true PBR bake. And you can name it whatever you want. So put OK. So baking this is a little bit different. So we have done we'll leave all this the same with cycles. We have done a normal bake where we had our selected to active. We have done an ambient occlusion bake with selective to active. In this case, we don't want that. We're going to be ignoring the cage and the high poly model. We just want to bake this as an image texture. So we're going to change the type to diffuse. Now, by default, a diffuse bake will probably have these light contributors selected. We're going to uncheck them. And you'll use this again if you're doing things like color swaps or decals or putting in a grunge map, things like that. So just know that it's a good thing to kind of get used to doing. So diffuse, only color, none of the lighting contributors. And now we just hit bake. And this one might take a little bit to bake, kind of like the AO did. All right, and so this is our baked image, and it looks exactly as I would expect. There's a lot of transparency. We see the highlights of the areas I've done in gloss pop out a bit, and they do appear as a higher green, but that's because of the way the ambient occlusion is interacting. Keep in mind these are being stored in separate channels, so if you're like, wait, where's my ambient occlusion map? Where's all this? That's fine. Just remember, this is exactly what you should see. This looks like what we want. So we are going to go ahead and take this image and save it. And just make sure that it's an RGBA image, and everything here you can leave as default, save image. And that is a rinky-dink way, and obviously I haven't shown a beautiful pure ending to it, but that is how you do a true PBR and bake your true PBR in Blender. All right, so node review. You have your roughness, which is our alpha, going into the alpha of our shader. We have our metal channel going into the red of our combined color. We have our AO going into the green of our combined color, and those colors going into our shader as if they are the base color. And so this ends up making your model look like it's wearing its PBR as its skin, which should be familiar to you because that's how we were doing the super fake PBRs. And from this, you will just bake it, making sure that you've got the ability to bake in your transparencies, and you'll see that it all comes up very beautifully. So these are different approaches. How much you actually gain from them really probably depends on your model, your workflow, what kind of time you have, what you want to do with certain things. And it's really just sort of up to you. You may find that this approach works well. You may say, hey, that's interesting, but I found that the fake PBR worked just as well, and I've got an orange that I like to paint steel with, and I'm using this orange for all my steel painting, and that is fine too. What I think is most important to learn from all this is what is possible to do so that you can embrace whatever works for you in painting your miniatures. Just remember, if you're doing it the fake way, the PBR police will not show up at your door and tell you you're doing it wrong. And since we've looked at these a lot in TaleWeaver, I'm not going to drag this into TaleWeaver. I do want to show you just a brief image of some of the differences between the fake PBR, the true fake PBR, and no PBR. And so here's what we're going to see from that. This is my mole model that I did, and you can see this posted up on the Mod.io. And these are the differences. So in this top row, I have the PBR images with a paint wash, with a true PBR where I did it all the right way, the fake PBR where I did it all the wrong way, and then no PBR at all. And then what it looks like without a paint wash with the true PBR, fake PBR, and no PBR. So what we get from this is the differences are ultimately very subtle. The paint wash does make a big difference. There are just a lot of tiny details that you'll see. Some of them are because of my painting. So for example, the metals between the true PBR and the fake PBR look fairly different, but I was also painting different values onto the bronze bracelet there. But what I want to illustrate here is that it's really a matter of what workflow does well for you and what you feel comfortable with. Because at the end of the day, these 6 images, aside from the no PBR, no paint wash image, aren't that critically different when it comes to the virtual tabletop environment. So I would just encourage you to do what works for your workflow, do what you feel is giving you what you need. Don't get bogged down on dealing with nodes and a lot of those things if those aren't rewarding to you. And that is all I have on fake and true PBRs. I hope everyone has a great day out there. Take care.
Ba-ba-da.